there's something about war. Yes, it brings out the worst in people, but it also brings out the best. And you find people that are truly unforgettable wherever you go in the world, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in the Congo, whether it's in, you know, the Middle East wars or the Bosnia war, things like this. You find people that truly stand out and inspire you, and you take that with you. You have to take away the positive, because otherwise, and you talk about this a lot, you know, the damage, the almost, you know, the post-traumatic stress that you get from doing this. It's not easy, and it's not easy to go through it. It's not easy, you know, to lose someone. Thank God I've never lost anyone that I was working with, but we've had colleagues that did. And it's a very tough thing. Times have changed, and it's tougher on freelancers now than it has ever been. A lack of support from any organized news agency, and they tend to use people up, let them absorb the danger. And the networks did this on a regular basis too. You know, Halan should know and have experienced that they'll push the local staff out there. They'll push them to take risks that they won't subject their own people to, who they've given medical coverage and emergency care and things like this. And so the journalist, the network journalist, must take care of the local journalists. First of all, we need them to survive. We can't tell the story without them, let's face it. Whether it's not just translating, it's knowing the streets. You know, there was a study in Bosnia where all of the casualties, or like 78% of the casualties, were in the first 48 hours. Why? Because people would fly in, you know, they had no idea about where they were, had no idea about the streets, and they would go to places where they should not have gone. They were too dangerous, but they were too stupid to know it. And one of the worst things that can happen is to be hooked up with someone who tells you, and Lord knows I've had it, where they say, you know, it's all right. I'll do anything. I'm not afraid. Well, as I told one guy, if you're not afraid, you're too stupid to work with me, because you've got to be afraid. That's what keeps you alive in all of this. Things have changed now so much in the news industry that I think it's more hazardous than it's ever been for people. I think I've got to confess, I mean, I didn't have war zone training, security training. If you had gotten wounded with me, I mean, it's just by the grace of God that I didn't have somebody wounded with me, because Lord knows we came close so many times. Snipers' bullets hitting, you know, doing a stand-up, and a sniper's bullet comes ripping in. We came so close. But if you had a sucking chest wound, all I could have done was hold your hand, because I had not a clue what to do. I had no war zone training. I had no medical training at all. And I look back on it and I say, good Lord, that was stupid.
You know, and the conversation, thank you very much for that. Thank you so, so much. You know, it's interesting to me, because when I was going out in the field in 2012, at the time, the person who was the head of CNN security, and he had actually gone out with Arwa and a few of those from the CNN team, but he had done a kind of a freelance ragtag hostile environment training in Tennessee. And so a bunch of us clobbered up there, and we spent 4.5 days getting sort of basic medic training and running through the woods and learning all of that stuff. And then I kind of did a refresher when I was in Iraq with a number of my colleagues and friends. And it was becoming in 2012, it was becoming kind of a thing. And now we're having the discussion among at least a lot of freelancers. We're having a lot of conversation where we're saying, okay, the training stuff's there. That's great. Now we've got some basic training, but we might want to talk about the psychological stuff that happens afterwards, because that has never been an enormous conversation. I do know that in CNN, that's a conversation that's probably been going on for a long time. I remember at the height of Syria in 2012, there had been an attack on a village where a number of children and people had been slaughtered. And I do remember, you know, at the time, an editor had gone to the international desk and said, I can't edit this. I can't do this. And so the head of our desk said, okay, well, we'll get someone else, and we understand, and kind of assigned each one of us a day on the desk. So we would take turns and have a break. But there's still, even over these years, within the wider journalist community, there's not enough conversation about the care afterwards. Marie Colvin, who is a hero of mine, still at the same time died because her mental capacity kept her there one more day.
Her desire, she had to be on the story. Listen,
kind of that addiction.
Colvin was my dear friend, and we covered so many stories together, beginning with the Intifada in Gaza and in the West Bank. And Marie and I were together. I remember we did an interview with Arafat, and we were the only ones out of perhaps 200 journalists. In the end, we got the interview with Arafat. You know why? Because we stayed there until 3 o'clock in the morning, knowing that if Arafat promised us we'd get an interview, we'd get the interview. You just had to outwait him. And Marie said to me at the time, she said, Jim, I'll hate it because tomorrow they'll say, Clancy and Colvin got the interview because Arafat likes them. And she said, look around. Who's still here? Marie Colvin stuck with the story. And one of the things that was terrible about the kidnappings in Beirut in the early 1980s, mid 1980s, was that every time a journalist got kidnapped, they were denigrated by their fellow journalists. Oh, he shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been doing that. It was a bad idea. Let me tell you, that's just the journalist's way of saying, oh, it couldn't happen to me. It can happen to you.
And I don't disagree with you. In fact, because I honor her so much in the work that she did. I think one of the conversations that's beginning to come up among younger journalists is how much of this is an addiction and how much we need to maybe take care of ourselves so that we can be better journalists or be better storytellers.
It's an adrenaline rush, and you get addicted to it and you want to go into it and you take risks you shouldn't. People ask me, what's the most dangerous place you've ever been? You know what the most dangerous place is? It's the empty road. Because you look down that road and the locals that live there, they're not on that road. Why? What do they know that you don't, since you don't know anything? And you have to take your salary. You have to cut out everything for taxes and everything else that you pay. And then you have to divide it by 250, the number of working days. And look at that number when you get to the bottom and say, am I going to take myself down that road for this much money? And 9 times out of 10, or maybe 10 times out of 10, you go, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. We take incredible risks, crazy risks, and we subject others who we work with to those same crazy risks. And yeah, it's an addiction. It definitely is. And you have to break it off at some point. Some people do better at it than others.
I hope that that's a message we can share with people in that sense, because, I remember there were times that I would get anxious and be, oh my God, I need to be at this place, or I need to be at this place, not just in Iraq, but, it took me a little extra time to get into Gaza, or to the extra story that was on the Lebanese border, or whatever was going on. And I did have a few mentors and older journalists who would be like, the story's going to be there. There's going to be another war tomorrow. Don't rush. And I think sometimes we get into this business, or we jump out into the field, and obviously the older you get, the more you learn. But I think sometimes when you jump out, it's that there's almost that adrenaline rush, that addiction that happens. And we have to kind of teach ourselves to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, the story will still be there, or there'll be a different one. Sometimes you have to care for the self in order to be able to shift into a way of thinking about it, because if you don't ever stop, then you're going to become, I think, it'll affect your work. Even me writing the book, I had a friend of mine who told me, he said, you have to step away from this place to really write about it the way that you want to. And he was right. He was very right. So,
Ash,
anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in to say, I think you hit on just an incredibly, incredibly important point. Jim and I have been in the business through the whole period from analog to digital before the internet was there, and all the addictive aspects of being a journalist, being on the scene, seeing these things, even as traumatic as all these things that we see in person are, there's an addictive quality to those. But then when you introduce the internet and then introduce social media to that, and this need, this feeding this addiction to be connected to it all the time, and this feeling that you describe of not wanting to miss something, not wanting to be disconnected from it, and actually feeling guilt that if you divert your attention from it just for a minute, that you've dedicated yourself to this, then that feeds an addiction again. It's so important to maintain, try to maintain a balance, trying to maintain distance, try to take emotional break, psychological break. I have a daughter who's in the industry now, works for a social media news gathering organization.
Yeah, I'd help her.
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult when you introduce the intensity and the volume of imagery of social media into the equation, that repetitive traumatic imagery, and then at the same time dealing with people who are taking these traumatic images, and you're in contact with them, so you're exposed to their trauma as well.
Here's a true story about that, Eli.
Go ahead, Jim.
Truckers were offered what they thought would be fabulous salaries to go to Iraq and drive trucks for the U.S. military. Well, as preparation, they got the videos off of YouTube that showed other truckers being executed by ISIS, or at that time it was ISIS, Al-Qaeda. And they watched these videos over and over again. They staged it so that, how would we get out? How would you, get the knife and get yourself untied? And of course, there was no way to do it. But these guys literally installed PTSD on themselves by absorbing those videos nonstop and then trying to act out what they would do to get out of that mess. It was insane. And they got PTSD out of it.
I think that's the other thing too, is that to me, and I actually talk about this in another chapter, but I think that PTSD is unexpressed grief. That ultimately it's what gets lodged into you and sort of sticks with you. And unless we begin to have conversations about how to process those emotions, whether it be through laughter, it can be through laughter, it can be through mourning, it can be through therapy, it can be through other activities. There's a myriad of ways to work with, the conversation around mental health as it concerns these things. And certainly people across Iraq and Syria are in desperate need of those resources as well. But it's something that, unless we begin to have those conversations about unpacking that grief, PTSD then just becomes this disorder, the stickler, and so many people are afraid of it. And in some places, people even shun another person, or they treat them as different, or even our veterans feel so stuck with things where they don't know how to overcome certain issues, and they end up homeless, they end up with families that are broken apart, and so forth. So we have to begin to have conversations about how we deal with not just those addictions, but we deal with those griefs, how we can insert laughter, community purpose into those spaces. Whether you walk away from the war zone or whether you continue in your journalist career, there has to be outlets for that. I do think that maybe more now than ever that those conversations are becoming a little more acceptable, but there's still stigmas that are attached. And I think we need to break that, because there has to be a journey of overcoming that to come to a sense of our own healing, our own oneness, our own community, whatever you believe in, whether you're a spiritual person or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just about being able to come back to your own sort of personal sacred self. And that, this is a journey that often doesn't always allow for that. And my hope is that we can change that conversation, because I don't feel like the story can stay as just a stagnant story. You've got to move it somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious to know what Halan and Matt, in your experiences, how have you managed this? this PTSD and this stress of being right in the heart of the situation. Halan?
I'm going to let Matt go. I'm still processing it.
Okay.
You know, I think I couldn't see what was happening to me. I needed someone outside to see for me, because I had lost perspective in such a significant way. So I don't know how much to get into that, but essentially for me, it was my wife. Basically, she was there with me. We lived in Iraq with our kids. We lived in Kurdistan. Sorry, we've got a Kurd on the call, and be respectful. But we lived in Kurdistan for about 8 years, and I think it was those few years around the ISIS crisis that something started shifting, but I wasn't aware of it until I was sort of way down the hole. And that's whenever my wife just said, no, like you need to get therapy. I don't need therapy. Yes, she never does this. She never makes demands. We are always having an open conversation and working really hard toward a kind of egalitarianism. But she just told me, no, like, we're not doing that here. You are going to get help. And that's why I'm in San Diego right now and not in the Middle East. It's because she said it's time to go get healthy. Like we need it, you know, because the secondary, either the primary or even the secondary, and even in some ways the tertiary trauma, which is a new concept, it was just recently introduced to me. That was sort of, I was just a sponge soaking it up in ways that I didn't even realize. And then I'm becoming a source of secondary trauma for my own children, who are very malleable 1 and 2 and 3-year-olds, right? And so I could see what was happening to me affecting them, and they don't even know what a Mosul is, you know? And so I think seeing the way that pain flows like water, and the way that it has to be dealt with, not necessarily dealt out, as we've seen, right? Just sort of returning pain for pain, eye for an eye, but choosing to figure out ways to let it stop with you and to deal with it yourself, so that you don't then transmit it on to someone else and continue these cycles of trauma that ultimately contribute to hate and all these systemic problems we know of. So for me, it was just my wife putting her foot down and saying, no, to hell with this. We're going to go get healthy. And that's what I needed. And I'm happier than I've ever been in my whole life right now. So
well,
I mean, that's not to say it wasn't joyful there, but
yeah,
I'm really, really incredibly grateful for her.